Very good evening to all pious yogis. This evening we shall discuss about conditionality. When meditators are able to see conditionality in the practice of vipassana meditation, then they can see correctly, rightly, the three common characteristics of mental and physical phenomena. Nothing can be arising without condition or without a cause. One of the discourses of the Buddha explains about the condition, where the Buddha explained that there are these three characteristics that define the conditions. These three characteristics that define the conditions are an arising is seen, a vanishing is seen, and its alteration while it persists is seen. So if it is unconditioned, then no arising is seen, no vanishing is seen, and no alteration while it persists is seen. If there is no unconditioned, then there is not possible to attain nibbana. If there is no unconditioned, then it is not possible to attain nibbana. So meditators have to realize conditionality, then they only can realize the three common characteristics. At the moment of realizing the three common characteristics of mental and physical phenomena, the meditators also realizing their individual characteristics. So meditators have to develop mindfulness in accordance with the guidelines or the principles. Mindfulness is also a mental process or mental state that has three characteristics: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. So mindfulness is also arising dependent on an object or phenomenon. If there's no object arising at that moment, then mindfulness can't arise. So it's because of its arising dependent on an object. That's why it's also not a permanent mental process. This is also explained in one of the discourses of the Buddha. That sutta is known as Sahetu Anicca Sutta, impermanent with the cause. The second characteristic, suffering, also because of the cause of a cause. The characteristics of anatta also arising and passing away because of a cause. So as you know, our objects of mindfulness meditation, vipassana meditations, are the five aggregates. So you have to understand that these five aggregates are not permanent, not satisfactory, and not self. So the Buddha said, rupa is impermanent. The cause and condition for the arising of rupa is also impermanent. As rupa has originated from what is impermanent, how could it be permanent? Similarly, feeling or Vedana, sanya perception, or sankara, or mental formation, vijnana, consciousness are impermanent. So the cause and condition for the arising of these aggregates are also impermanent. So these aggregates have originated from what is impermanent. How could they be permanent? So if meditators do not practice mindfulness correctly, then it's difficult to see conditionality, or in other words, cause and effect. So as you know, 5 aggregates in fact constitute nama rupa. So we can say that nama rupa are the objects of vipassana meditation. So their arising are dependent on each other. At the beginning of practice, meditators could not see clearly that their arising are dependent on each other. It's because the mindfulness is not sharp enough, and meditators have not yet attained a deep concentration. So meditators have to put forth effort to develop mindfulness constantly, continuously, for longer and longer period of time. Meditators have to direct the mindfulness to the objects of meditations. So mindfulness here means the attention of the mind, or the attention at that present moment. So sometimes we instruct meditators to pay attention to whatever object is arising at that present moment. If we explain from the other angle, meditators have to give an object or phenomenon to the mind. If there's no object, then the mind has no work to do, or then the mind will be wandering, thinking, or even fall into sleepiness and so on. So meditation is a mental work. So we have to make the mind working all the time. So when there's an object, then there's work for the mind to do. In other words, for the mind to establish mindfulness. So at the beginning of the practice, meditators have to direct the attention of mind, for example, to the movements of abdomen during sitting meditation. If the movements has stopped, or the movements is not clearly perceived, meditators can direct the attention of the mind to the alternative. So meditators have to direct the mind to the alternative, in other words, paying attention to the sitting postures and note it as sitting, then pay attention to a touching point and note it as touching, and so on. So the most important thing is that meditators have to pay attention to an object, then they make the mental noting. So meditators begin the sitting meditation by being mindful of the movements of the abdomen, or the sitting postures and the touching point. So when meditators are mindful of one of the objects. If there's another stronger object arising in the body, then meditators should be mindful of the other stronger object. So in fact, when the other object is stronger than the object that the meditators are mindful at that time, definitely the mind will notice the other stronger object. Then meditators should mindful of the other stronger object. So not keep the mindfulness with the present object. So the guideline is to mindful of the strongest object that's arising in the body at that moment. If there's no strong body if there's no other strong body objects, then meditators should direct the attention of the mind back to the basic object. In other words, be mindful of the movement of abdomen or the sitting postures and the touching point. Whenever meditators are mindful of any body object or body sensation, then there's a mental state rising. For example, a thinking. The meditators are mindful and note the thinking as soon as possible. Actually, thinking is a mental state which is quite obvious. As long as meditators put forth enough effort in the practice and the mind is quite alert, it's not difficult to know that there's a thinking happening at that moment. So at the moment of knowing there's a thinking, or at the moment noticing the mind is thinking, then meditators should be mindful and know it as soon as possible. But sometimes some meditators might think that although he or she becomes aware there's a thinking, but they have the idea that the mindfulness is still staying with the movement with the movements of the abdomen. If meditators put a lot of efforts to focus the attention on the movement of abdomen, putting a lot of efforts to keep the mindfulness with the movement of abdomen, then the mindfulness will become slower, or will become slower to note the thinking mind. But if the mindfulness is active, as soon as there's thinking arising, the mindfulness is no longer observing the movement of abdomen. So if the mindfulness is active, meditators shall be able to mindful of the thinking mind quite instantly, and most likely the thinking mind will also disappear quite soon. When the thinking has disappeared, then if there's enough clear object arising, the mindfulness will immediately note that object. But when the mindfulness is not yet well developed, when the thinking has disappeared, meditators may have to direct the attention to the basic object again, for example, the movement of abdomen or the sitting postures and so on. So when meditators keep on practicing in accordance with the guideline, then they may be able to realize that when the thinking has disappeared, mindfulness goes back to the movement of the abdomens by itself if the movement of abdomens is very clear. So meditators should quickly follow the mindfulness and note rising, falling, and so on. When meditators are mindful of the rising movements or the falling movements of the abdomen, then there's a sharp pain arising. If the mindfulness is active, meditators may realize that the mindfulness appears almost instantly with the arising of that sharp pain. Then meditators begins to gain little bit experience on the characteristics of the anatta. In other words, meditators can't exercise control over the process of mindfulness. If there's a strongest object arising, clearer than the object that the meditators are mindful at that present moment, then the mindfulness will move by itself to the other stronger object. So meditators can't make a choice or make a choice. I want to be mindful of the object, the present object, not the other stronger object. So when meditators are able to increase the mental effort gradually, then the mindfulness also will be getting more and more attentive and precise. So mindfulness is also defined or interpreted as a full attention. At the beginning of practice, meditators might not be able to pay full attention to one object at each moment. So that's why meditators might have to direct the attention of mind to the strongest object. It's because when the mindfulness is not strong enough, meditators might think that the mind is perceiving 3-4 objects at the same moment. But it's not possible for the mind to perceive 2 objects or 2 phenomena at the same moment. So meditators need to direct the attention to the strongest object and do not take interest in other less distinct objects. Meditators also do not take interest in the sound or the noise of the environment. If the attention always goes out to the sound, to the noise of the environment, then meditators can't develop a stronger and sharper mindfulness. So when meditators keep on developing mindfulness constantly, continuously, then they shall realize eventually that the mindfulness is perceiving one object at each moment. So when mindfulness is so strong and able to perceive one object at each movement for a period of time, the meditators begins to gain concentration. So the concentration developed by the mindfulness meditators, vipassana meditators, is deep enough and enable meditators to realize the true natures of mental and physical phenomena. So this concentration is known as momentary concentration or Khanika Samadhi. It is defined in the sub-commentary as momentary unification of mind. So if this momentary unification of mind is not interrupted by thinking or other hindrances, then that concentration is strong enough, enable meditators to gain some experiences or wisdoms. So meditators begins to realize, for example, sabhava lakkhana of the phenomena, or in other words, the individual characteristics of the phenomena. If meditators have not attained deep concentration, then it's not possible to realize the specific characteristics of the phenomena clearly. Without concentration, if meditators want to experience the Paramatha Dhamma, it's not possible. When there's no concentration, meditators can't go beyond the concept or immediately. That's why meditators perceive the abdomen is moving, then they can mindful and note it as rising or falling. Meditators perceive that the foot is moving. For example, the heel is moving, then they can note it as lifting, perceiving the foot is moving forward, being pushed forward, then they can note it as pushing, and so on. So this mental noting or labeling is known as tatya panyati. It means the name, this is called the term or the words used in common by everyone. When we say rupa or feelings, perceptions, and so on, this is known as vijja mana panyati. So this is a concept of something that's real. If there's no panyati, then it's not possible to communicate. Sometimes meditators might think that it's not that Vipassana meditators should not make any mental noting or labelings, because noting or labeling is concept. So they think this is concept, and this concept is a hindrance to realize the ultimate reality or Paramatha Dhamma. But if there's no labeling or noting, then it's not possible for meditators to know what object or what phenomenon that they are mindful at that moment. Then it's not possible, for example, to go for interview, to report on their experience, what object did they mindful and realize, and so on. So meditators have to realize that this tatya panyati helps to lead the mind to the actual experience of the phenomena. One of the benefits of mental noting is to help to make the mindfulness more active. And it's because meditators wish to note the object. That's why they need to put more mental effort in order to perceive whatever object is arising at that present moment. If there's no noting or labeling at all, then the mind could maybe not so focused in the practice. But when we sometimes we talk about mental noting or labeling, sometimes meditators may not have to mentally say rising, falling. Sometimes it's not necessary to say it mentally. Sometimes meditators have a clear perception of a short process of rising movements or short process of mind falling movements. Meditators are not able to make any mental noting because perceiving a short process of rising movements or short process of falling movements, then it's quite difficult to note it mentally or say it mentally, rising, falling. But mere perceptions of precisely of that short process of mindfulness or short process of rising movements or falling movements itself is mindfulness. So meditators have to make use of the mental noting wisely. This mental noting is helpful to the practice. In other words, to develop more attentive and precise mindfulness, and in order to gain clearer and clearer experience in vipassana meditations. If meditators mentally say the object frequently, for example, lifting, but without perceiving the actual process of lifting movements, the meditators will not be able to develop the mindfulness and gain clear experience. Sometimes some meditators make mental noting very frequently in order to prevent the thinking from arising. In that way, that mental noting doesn't serve any purpose. So meditators have to realize that this is mindfulness meditation, not a labeling meditation. So when there's concentration, then meditators begin to see the movements clearly. For example, meditators perceive that there's only process of rising movements. So at that time, the meditators realize there's a process of the mindfulness that note the rising movements. Besides these two processes, the process movements and the process mindfulness, there's nothing else. If there's a physical phenomenon, for example, hardness, meditators will be realizing that there's only this phenomenon, hardness, and a process of mindfulness that note the hardness. So at the time, meditators did not perceive the hardness, for example, as a hardness of the bone. Sometimes meditators mindful of the touching, the hands touching the bone, then they feel the hardness of the bone and note hardness. Sometimes meditators mindful of the dropping of the foot. When the foot is touching the floor, they perceive hardness of the floor or warmness or coldness of the floor. At that time, meditators have not yet realized hardness or warmness rightly. When meditators could perceive, for example, hardness, clearly, or the movements of the rising clearly. At that time, there's no idea of the abdomen or the form of the abdomen. But if meditators have not attained deep concentration, then it's not possible to perceive movements as movements or hardness as hardness. So in other words, the experience of a Paramatha Dharma, for example, movements, hardness, that experience is going beyond concept. Meditators can't condition the mind to know various processes, movements, for example, movement of abdomen, movements of foot as movements. Sometimes some meditators in the practice vipassana meditation, when they are mindful of any process of movements, the mind is only thinking that this is only movements, this is only movements, as if this putting an input in the mind, putting an input in the mind that this is only movements, this is only movements. So this is not the real experience. Meditators need to pay full attention to the process movements, experience it fully. So when concentration is deep enough, the meditators will be realizing that the process of mindfulness is arising dependent on an object. If there is no process of rising movements, do you think the mindfulness will be arising at that time? The mindfulness can't arise if there is no movements of rising. But when meditators have not attained deep concentration, they could not realize clearly that the mindfulness is arising dependent on that object. So if there is no painful sensation arising in the body, do you think you can mindful and not pain? You can't mindful and not pain because that painful sensation doesn't exist. So when you practicing correctly, then you begin to see the cause and effect. So when you develop the mindfulness better and better, you realize that the mindfulness is going towards the object. The mindfulness, just like the consciousness, has the characteristics of cognizing or knowing the object. And the physical phenomena, for example, hardness, movements, do not have the characteristics of cognizing or knowing. So that rising movements, is it a permanent process, everlasting process? That rising movements, is it a permanent process, an everlasting process? Is also subject to passing away. Then the mindfulness, which is arising dependent on that movements, which is not permanent. So do you think that process mindfulness is a permanent process or an everlasting process? So that mindfulness also subject to passing away. So if meditators do not understand well about the conditionality, then they may exercise control over the process of mindfulness. For example, sometimes meditators perceive there's a process of rising movements. When the movement has stopped or disappeared, some meditators are still keeping the mindfulness there, holding the mindfulness there, waiting for the next process of falling movements and so on. So if the process rising movements has disappeared, by right the mindfulness is also disappear at the time. Then when there's a process falling movements appear, then what will happen or what will arising? Then there will another process mindfulness appear. So do you think this process mindfulness which is arising dependent on the falling movements, this process mindfulness is same as the mindfulness that noted the rising movements? Or are they the same process of mindfulness? Are they the same process mindfulness, or are they two different processes of mindfulness?
The answer is different.
Different. So I hope you answer from your experience. So similarly, when you practice walking meditation, you may realize lifting process is one object, pushing process is another object. So there is no single process mindfulness. So when the mindfulness getting better with deep concentration, meditators also come to realize physicality or rupa sometimes arising dependent on mentality. So here meditators begins to realize that every process of physical movements and actions are preceded by the mind. If there's no, for example, if there's no intention, then there's no movements. If the concentration is not deep enough, then meditators could not perceive the intention clearly. If there's no deep concentration, meditators can't see the intention at all. So they can't make a mental noting intending if they do not perceive intentions. So it's important to note the object which is being perceived clearly. The arising is being perceived clearly. Then meditators can mindful and note it. So if meditators could perceive the intention clearly, eventually they come to realize the relationship between the intention and the process of the movements. So this intention is different from desires. For example, sometimes meditators feel a strong itchy sensations. They may want to scratch it. They realize there's desire to scratch it. Then they should not desire. If they could not desire until that desire has disappeared, then meditators would not scratch it. If meditators could overcome such mental state, desire to scratch, or desire to move, or move the sitting postures whenever there's a strong pain or discomfort, then their mindfulness will be strengthened become stronger. At the same time, meditators also develop their patience. So, in fact, the foundations of the progress of vipassana meditation is purification of view, Dithi Visuddhi. So meditators realize that at each moment there's only a pair of processes. One process is the object, the other process is a process mindfulness or the noting mind. So the object can be a physical object or mental object. So it's because there's object arising, the mindfulness will be arising almost at the same moment. Then during the practice walking meditation and mindfulness of daily duties, there's a realization that all the process of movements as well as intention, as well as the actions are preceded by the mind or mental states of intention or wanting to do. There's no I or a self or behind the intention or the mental state of wanting. And so that intention or wanting is also a natural mental process. So in the commentaries, Visuddhimagga explained this purification of view in terms of interdependence of mentality and physicality. It is like a two bundle of reeds propped one against the other. Each one gives the other support. So when one falls, the other falls as two. So the Namarupa always occurs as an interdependent state. So the commentary explained with various simile. For example, just like the sound occurs having as its support a drum that's beaten by the stick. So the drum is one and the sound is another. The drum and the sound are not mixed up together. So the drum is void of sound and the sound is void of the drums. So just like the arisings of the mentality and physicality, mentality is one, materiality is another, or the physicality is another. So the mentality is void of physicality, and the physicality is void of mentality. Both arise dependent on each other, in other words, due to cause or due to conditions. So the ancient teachers say that Namarupa are twins, and each supports the other. When one breaks up, they both break up through interconditionality. So when meditators are able to see cause effect or conditionality well, then when they can sustain the effort, mindfulness and concentration, then they begin to see the three common characteristics clearly. So meditators can't exercise control over the process of mindfulness or process of any phenomena. So meditators come to realize that every process is a natural process. So this is the foundations of the progress of a vipassana meditation. So meditators have to realize that mental process of mindfulness is not a permanent process. There's no single process of mindfulness. When the practice is getting better and better, meditators also could realize that the mindfulness also become an object, a cause for the arising of next process of awareness. In other words, there's no I or a self watching this pair of processes. An object can arise, can condition the arising of another process. So this process is being conditioned by an object. This process also can be conditioning the arising of another process. So the teaching of the Buddha about conditionality, or in other words, dependent origination, is very profound. So there's a saying that if one wishes to see the Dharma, one has to see dependent originations. So I wish all meditators will put forth effort to develop mindfulness constantly, continuously, so that you could realize cause and effect clearly, and make more and more progress in attaining your spiritual goal, this ultimate purity of mind soon.
สาธุ สาธุ สาธุ